I will shortly just ask you my first question, and then you can just go and give us an introduction of your work around blockchain. Just one little remark about the thing about ethics belonging to religion. I think ethics belongs as much to religion as technology belongs to magic. So to the extent that technology is not magic, ethics is not religion, you could say, in a way. But coming back to our questions here, and we might actually also touch on some of the questions that came up, where does the art come in, not only in regard to Jörg, but maybe also in a broader sense. But also, I think, at some point, we need to come to the important question of where does the ethics come here, not only the aesthetics. And in regard to blockchain, that is a very specific question, as blockchain, by its very nature, is built on the idea of intransparency, on the idea that there is something, there's a cryptified code, a set of algorithms that are removed from any direct access, which makes them valuable. So can you tell us how you ventured from previous work, which was more dealing, for example, with strange internet entrepreneurs like Kim.com, to this particular world, which you've been seemingly fascinatingly followed for quite some years now, thinking of, for example, your involvement in the Berlin Biennial, right, where you made a major piece about blockchain companies.
Yeah, thanks, Jörg, and thanks everybody here who invited us. Yeah, that's true. I've been, my practice in general tries to look at specific examples of what's going on in tech industry and unpack what's happening culturally there at the same time, to look at messages that large influential people and companies are kind of pushing, and try to complicate those or unpack them a little bit. And so my work has led me into meeting with technologists, entrepreneurs, people building companies, venture capitalists, and yeah, maybe there's two big hype words at the moment in investment, and one is AI, whatever that means, as I say, neural nets or whatever it actually means. And the other is blockchain, and I have chosen to work more on looking at what the blockchain conversation is.
But I guess we will have a chance to point out a couple of parallels and maybe interactions between those two fields.
Yeah, so this is what this slide is about, because they're not, it's interesting, they're often defined as opposites in some ways, or they are by certain people, but they also are working together. So yeah, blockchain plus AI, one simple thing is they're both based on automation. So there's a degree of automation to markets that happens in cryptocurrency and other blockchain-like things. And there's this kind of question between who owns data. So I mean, one of the big questions that comes up in AI, and maybe that moves on to this slide, yeah, is I think a lot of people have become aware of the situation where big, giant companies kind of own the internet. So if the internet started as an attempt at having decentralized communication systems be a kind of global thing, we've hit, after Web 2.0, several companies, the GAFA group, and others in other regions, becoming very centralized in their control of those systems. And also in terms of building AI systems, you need data, and these companies have more data than everybody else in the world on behavior and systems, because they basically record and detail everything that's going on.
And more computing power too.
And they have more computing power, and they have recruiting power and financial power and political power, and yeah, so they have the many smart people working for them, and the ability to hire many other smart people, and the best data, and whatever. So you can see how centralization becomes an issue in terms of this conversation. And this is where the blockchain question comes back, because blockchain is kind of considered to be a possibility to re-decentralize the internet. So to say that actually through having I mean, I'm going to skip through a couple of things. Oh yeah, this is one stupid thing to bring up, but to illustrate this idea, Peter Thiel, who's a guy that I've paid a lot of attention to because he has citizenship now in New Zealand and a big impact on the political discussion in New Zealand, which is where I'm from. He said recently in a talk at the beginning of the year, crypto is decentralizing and AI is centralizing, or if you want to frame it more ideologically, crypto is libertarian and AI is communist, which I think is kind of a cute way to frame this. This discussion.
And there is some kernel of truth to it, isn't there?
Well, this is the thing, because I think what he means there is communism is a centralized system of decision making.
He's probably thinking of China and its social ranking system, for example.
For example, but also just in terms of like a generalized idea of central planning being something that is a centralized system, and that's what communism is potentially. And then
it's not strictly speaking communism,
no,
but that's
exactly,
another story.
It's a shorthand for what it was going on.
Just a little footnote about the social ranking system. I'm not an expert in it, but I've talked to people in Beijing recently about it, and what I learned is also from other sources that what makes it so uncanny really is that not only is it a black box, but also all the factors that go in are very hard to justify, actually. For example, if you buy a bottle of alcohol, and even if you only buy it for a friend, it will cause a tiny minus on your social ranking. Yeah. So it will create all these other schemes of people trying to avoid that happening, and it will create a sort of, let's say, also lots of false negatives, lots of processes happening that you don't first realize that will eventually be discovered as being damaging, even for the ones who are enforcing this obviously anti-democratic and autocratic system. Yeah. So.
I mean, I also
just
think
as a little side.
Well, as a response to that side note, I also think there was a discussion of whether this could be something that happens in Europe, and that there is some kind of fundamental mindset difference that means that it won't be a system like that in Europe, which I fundamentally disagree with. I think it's not something that is only possible in a Chinese-like mindset or system. I think that's not true.
Especially if you have countries where you have a political move to the right, to the autocratic, like in Poland, for example, where judges have been released of their jobs. Now some of them are coming back. Or think of Britain, which is one of the most surveyed countries in the world. It has the biggest density of surveillance cameras.
Exactly. And even if you just think of Facebook and Google as systems that, can, to a high degree of granularity, supposedly categorize people's behaviors and personalities and all these kinds of things, the infrastructure is already there. It just takes a different implementation of that. And it may not be a hard power one, it may be a soft power one. So it may be that these scores are done by suggestion or under the radar rather than explicitly kind of given to people.
And in the private sector, let's say healthcare, insurance, banking, you will not get a credit or not get the kind of insurance you wanted, or you have to pay more than others without knowing why.
Exactly.
And even the person selling it to you might not know why.
Right. Exactly.
And the biases that go into that are amplified, like because you live in an African American neighborhood of LA, you get a worse ranking in your health insurance. And so on.
Yeah. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So anyway, pushing back against this system, blockchain has been, in some circles, proposed as some sort of alternative to that, where data can be owned by the people rather than by users rather than by centralized systems. And just to give a short intro, some definitions. So Bitcoin was introduced as an automated bookkeeping system. So it's basically, and a privately issued global internet currency. This automated bookkeeping system contains the blockchain, which is this kind of ledger of all transactions that happen on the network. So that's basically what the blockchain is. It's only a database or a ledger of all transactions that happen on the Bitcoin network. And then there was a kind of a secondary kind of technology that was added where you could further automate on that automated ledger in terms of designing contracts that could be automatically executed. And that's what a secondary system like Ethereum, which is the kind of next known network after Bitcoin in terms of cryptocurrency, was enabled.
Let me just ask, and I'm totally not an expert when it comes to the actual coding and computing side of it. how much or not has any kind of more sophisticated machine learning any role to play in cryptocurrency currently? Or is it just straightforward piling up of algorithms?
I would say algorithms is a difficult word to throw in there as well.
Yeah,
I think that's maybe not the correct term, but I think it's automated in the fact that the ledger is kept as part of so a record of all transactions is kept as part of the network, but it's not a neural net, it's not anything like an AI. But where blockchain can interact with AI, and I have a few companies examples of that, is like where you can deal with packages of data and records of data. So it's again, it's not a machine learning thing. That's something on the AI side.
Yeah.
But there are ways in which blockchains, which are record keeping, privacy keeping, potentially distribution systems that can be used to design different ways to govern things, that can come and interact with systems of AI and learning. And actually, the Sophia bot that we had that is interesting. Interacting with one of those blockchains, which I'm going to talk about soon as well. But yeah, just to say that there's this notion that there's several paradigms. So there's Web 1.0, which was maybe the 90s and maybe culminated in Google and search, and maybe Web 2.0, which is culminating in Facebook, something like that, as a social web. The people who believe in the blockchain narrative say that there's a Web 3, which will be also a private layer of currency on top of things, and a kind of incentive networks. So you can design ways to behave through giving people rewards as a part of the web.
Talking about rewards, isn't that also a system, by the way, to train AI, cookies, they sometimes call them? Would you describe that as I mean, we're not talking about emotions here, maybe in the strict sense, but it is the closest maybe you get to affects like reward, you know, which is something that is connotated with pleasure, and punishment, which is connotated with pain, right? So there is a system in place that seems to go towards that direction.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, system design is something important to every computing problem, and one of the things that when I took a deep dive into the culture around blockchains is you come up to game theory very quickly, and but part of any kind of cybernetic system design involves thinking about game theory, which is how you influence people's behavior by system design, right? And cryptocurrencies, giving people money for participating in a system, or tokens, some sense of a money-like system as a reward for participating. That's one way of incentive design, and then I think what you're talking about is the kind of other way. But yeah, that's I guess a simple thing. I mean, just to say also that it's a local thing as well, what we're talking about here. So Zug, which is not so far away from where we're speaking today, is considered to be Crypto Valley. So a number of things, including the Ethereum network that I was talking about before, they have their kind of legal status in Zug. It's obviously, well, the main reason for that is because of tax reasons, because Zug is, I think, the lowest tax in Switzerland even as a region. But it's kind of interestingly close to the development here.
I mean, isn't it also because Switzerland is quite adamant about shielding data privacy as opposed to other countries where you might register for even lower taxes, but are not sure.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. There's this kind of privacy aspect to it as well. I mean, I did, just to return to that, I did several deep dives into what future geopolitics powered by the technology behind Bitcoin might look like. This is an eFlux article that looks like a Business Insider article that I made about these possibilities. And as Jörg said, I looked into different blockchain companies and did something at the Berlin Biennale where I made a kind of a trade fair looking at different possible geopolitical futures as promotional stands based on that. And that was, one way of doing it. I'm used to using a different system where you can jump around a bit more, but I'm just going to cycle through into some examples of how AI and blockchain interact through a whole bunch of different projects I was going to touch on, but maybe won't. Yes, whoops.
That's the wrong one.
No, that's correct. yeah, there's a number of ways that AIs and blockchain are interacting. So yeah, data exchange and kind of data markets is one place. So every AI system needs data inputs and different data sets to work with. And there's blockchain companies which are proposing usages for those and different decentralized ways of spreading around the data. So this company is a marketplace for data where users are paying sources with digital tokens, so this kind of private layer. And unlike Google and Facebook, which store data from the users, the marketplace on Ocean protocol, which is this one here, will not have the data themselves. The users will own the data. And there's many systems like that. Like this Oasis Labs is another one that nobody gets the data produced in the Oasis network. It obscures the data being produced in cryptographically secured bundles, so it can be processed without disclosing the data. So you get the data that you are going to put into your system as a cryptographically encased kind of bundle. You then put it through your system to do whatever machine learning it is, but you can't kind of like unpack that completely. It's only visible to the system and not to the user, which is also potentially problematic. But
I was going to say, isn't that weird? Like I'm struggling to find a metaphor, but you're saying basically, so let's say I have a cow here and I want that cow to make really great milk. And this company says, we have this great food for your cow. You have to feed it for 1 year, and after that you have the best milk in the world. But then it turns out something else happens. You know, this kind of false negatives. Or, I mean, it actually, as a metaphor, I had to think of glyphosate, the detergent that's been used to wipe out weed, and now we learn, well, it might have an effect on insect population. Right? It's not fully proven yet, but it's very likely. Yeah. So we have a huge collateral damage because simply it was a false negative. Nobody seems to have seen that coming. Maybe some people did and put it under the carpet. Right. That's always the big question. Right. But with AI, it seems these kinds of problems seem to multiply because even the people programming it don't know what's happening inside the black box. Right. Plus, you have the false negatives, which is effects. Even if they know what's happening inside, there are going to be effects that nobody has predicted because of certain protocols having been in place that had a damage or a bug, and so on and so on. Is the same true for Bitcoin?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if that paradigm, I mean, certainly developments of cryptocurrencies and even the fact that, you know, we've never had a global private currency that has not been state issued and not interacted with some kind of state monitored global banking system. The fact that we haven't had that until Bitcoin is a huge untested space. So it's really like a move into a kind of total free market. There's a narrative around Bitcoin and blockchain, which is to say that, you know, it emerged at the time of the financial crisis. So Bitcoin first emerged in 2008, 2009, which was in the wake of the financial crisis. And again, this kind of story about like not trusting the existing state systems, not trusting the elites that run the financial markets, and then kind of looking into what an alternative could be. And then suddenly there was this kind of technical alternative, which meant that supposedly there was no third party involved, you know, stamping things and saying that we're issuing currency. There was no elite system. The kind of system itself was issuing the currency. That was the narrative, right? And there was this whole kind of set of stories around whether you can trust banks and whether you can trust banking and whether you can trust states. And it said, no, instead you should trust technologies and trust systems designers and trust engineers. But I guess the question then comes up as to whether engineers are inherently more trustworthy than democratically elected governmental systems.
Let me quickly switch the perspective. I think we all got at least a vague idea now how this all works, and you're sort of more immersed in it than many of us, I guess, because you've been following it for years now. But the crucial point is you're making contemporary art in response to it or in resonance with it. Right. And I would like to know, it seems there are different levels to that. One level is, if we see the work that you showed earlier from the Berlin Biennial, don't worry. I mean, it's basically let's say it's an imagined or an actual possible trade fair stand, right? It has a certain aesthetics that comes from trade fairs, from business, from startup business. You have done videos which I would say let's say, ape
Yeah.
to a certain extent the kind of pep talk, ex-TED
Right.
teaser videos,
Right.
you know, and so you're basically dealing with a sort of, let's say, pop art, from the pop art tradition coming idea of sort of quoting stuff, of reproducing stuff,
Yeah.
of mirroring stuff, but also at the same time somehow framing them in a way where it becomes something different.
Right.
Has there been a way for you, and that's and that's my actual question, where we're talking about something that is ultimately invisible, right? There is no, I mean, or maybe it isn't. The question is, this is mainly about encrypted data processes. How do these encrypted data processes themselves become something valuable for contemporary art expression or contemporary art conceptualization?
Yeah, so I recently curated a show in Berlin which looked at a number of different people who are working with blockchain technology and different ways of working with data and AI, and I can kind of take you through a few examples of how artists are using the blockchain technology itself. This is an image of that show. It's called Proof of Work, which is the name of the mining process used to produce cryptocurrency. It's at the Schinkel Pavilion here, and I worked with it. My curatorial process was not just that I was making all the decisions. I tried to distribute decision making to reflect kind of distributed decision making systems that like people in blockchain love. And so there are many curatorial nodes in the system, and this was a kind of, like a diagram of how the curatorial decision making was done. So the Schinkel Pavilion asked me, I then worked with my assistant Annalisa, who's also a curator, and then invited Harm and Ord and Kia and Distributed Gallery and other people, and then that was then the selection of artists. So that was one way that was kind of distributed blockchain-like curating as a structure. Okay. We then, this is the installation images. There was a giant bubble as an artwork, which is actually an artwork made by a company called Foam, who are working on a GPS blockchain system. So it's like a different way of managing and thinking about space, but with tokenized currency on top of it. It's thought to be maybe moving in the direction of urban planning. So if you have a kind of Google Maps type interface and you say, and you upload a plan for this particular street in this particular area, people then come and give their kind of internal tokens to that plan if they like it. And if that attracts enough currency, then it's built. That's the idea for the system. And they also made these, what they call decentralized architectural bubbles, called a decentralized mining station, which is literally like an inflatable room blown up by the heat generated by an Ethereum miner. So these kind of computers that make cryptocurrency then inflated this bubble. So this is what these machines look like. This cryptocurrency miner, it's adapted from gaming computing systems.
I was going to say there's one interesting parallel to AI, because for both systems you use graphic, what are they called?
GPUs, like graphic processing units.
GPU, graphic protocol units, right?
Processing, yeah.
Processing units, there you go. Which means because they're more powerful, but also they have a different way of making the computing than regular.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know about AI, but the reason why they're used in Bitcoin miners is because they're just like they're made to do a high level of processing, and like Bitcoin as a system needs the computer to contribute a lot of work to solving cryptographic problems as a kind of proof that it's running the system, and you get rewarded by that with Bitcoin or whatever other cryptocurrency is in there. So if you give your computing power to the network, it rewards you with cryptocurrency for your participation in setting up this network. Anyway, so that creates a lot of heat, it creates a lot of resources. It's a very heavy processing system, which is also has a very bad environmental problem. And again, this kind of bubble artwork I think is quite an interesting thing for that, because it's blowing the heat in from there. And
has there been any startup that try to address the ecological side of it?
Many, yeah. So I mean, this is a well-known problem within the blockchain sector, and so proof of work as a system, this way of kind of mining, is there are several kind of propositions from other companies of how to do it in a different way, but none have been as successful as proof of work as a kind of incentive structure system yet. So there's proof of stake, there's proof of cooperation even, which is run by Faircoin, which is one of the more interesting coins in the space that are trying to do other types of systems. But yeah, it's a very known problem, and even those who support Bitcoin hate the fact that it has this kind of huge ecological footprint. Inside that bubble there was another artwork which was a money-burning crypto issuing jukebox. So you put like oh, here we go. You put your kind of fiat currency in the top, so your money in the top. It then burned in this kind of like tray, and then it issued a little token which replaced your money with crypto money, and then it kind of played a song afterwards, which was a kind of a playful look at how challenging existing systems are being, how a privately issued technology, software designer governed system is very destructive to the possibility of existing money systems. So it's called a chaos machine.
Yeah. I was wondering, I mean, now that you've looked very closely at the Bitcoin world for quite some time, what's your prediction about the direction it's going? Is it going in a whatever exactly progressive or emancipative means, but is it going into a direction of progression towards a more, let's say, a better society? Again, we don't know what that is, but or is it clear it's going to fall back on the same mechanisms that we've seen with previous technological innovations? Will there be the big players who will, and the surveillance and all the kinds of things that are going to happen? Yeah,
I mean, that's a debate. In the current landscape, let's say, there's already big players. So the Ethereum network, for example, some of the founders of that network own a lot of the private currency that is worth a certain amount of money. So there's already a sense of unequal distribution in this idea of what should have been a decentralized system.
So could it even be the worst of the internet world combined with the worst of the banking world?
I think that's one possible outcome, which is very true.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like even people that I know that are working on it are like, am I building some kind of accelerated hyper-capitalism, which is based on the same principles as the kind of neoliberal banking world that we all kind of don't like or whatever, or am I building something which is like having another system? Sorry, I didn't realize that we were going to do it. So that's really a question that even the developers working on it ask themselves. But I mean, there is
a kind of black box there.
Potentially, but I mean, I think what is hopeful and what people do really want to see is this idea of a distributed ledger that can encrypt little packages, and this is again like what we've been talking about with the AI systems and these companies that I briefly scrolled through that look at different ways of interacting blockchain functionality into distributing data. I think there's still this idea that we have the centralized internet now, we have the Googles and the Facebooks of the world, we need a different model for data ownership, and blockchain has been one of the kind of like more projected upon areas of providing an alternative where if you have a granular currency and a way to tie that to your data, which you can do with certain ways of organizing blockchains, that you can say, I own this data, I charge this company to use this data for this purpose only, and they will reward me with currency, and I can turn that on and off as I like, and it's not something that has to happen from only these other large centralized systems. That's,
one question I have, again, having no real insight yet, if we're talking about the connection between Bitcoin and AI, we've talked about the parallels in terms of the computing power that is needed and the way it is computed through graphics protocols coming from gaming culture. So there's this parallel, but there seems yet still the difference that AI is centralized in a way. Right. It's MIT, it's Google, it's Apple, etc.
Yeah.
Is there a perspective of AI being decentralized, maybe even through Bitcoin systems?
Exactly, and these are what I was clumsily trying to show before, that there are companies building on exactly this idea, that AI and machine learning needs big data to kind of work with, because you've got to have a lot of data and the right data to feed into your system for it to learn what you want, the things that it should learn. But it doesn't need to be all controlled by these things, and if you have a group of decentralized networks of independent players working on different models for AI, which then have a kind of a marketplace which they can exchange that material on, then that might be some better version. But yeah, it relies on the fact that that there has to be other models than all the kind of relevant data gets sucked up to a small amount of companies. So it means that you have to design the system a little bit differently.
Which will also mean that AI can be out of control, right?
Yeah, potentially. That's the other thing with decentralized systems, and happened in blockchain already. So there was a kind of blockchain-based corporation called a decentralized autonomous organization, which is a kind of a blockchain-based corporation that held a lot of money and was kind of like an investment firm. It was hacked, and because it was decentralized and nobody owned it, it was difficult to repair, and the kind of money was lost. And the solution that the Ethereum network that it was based on had to that problem was to simply fork the kind of timeline that is in a normal kind of blockchain system, which is supposed to be unchangeable. The community decided to take an alternative timeline and just kind of like have that whole thing not be counted on the blockchain, which is something it's not supposed to do.
Away or something.
Yeah, but so there's many moments of that, and if that gets into kind of AI and big data management, of course you could have similar problems. I have to run away now, unfortunately, but I'm
As
sure
you run, one last question. What
Yeah.
do you make of the whole conspiracy theories that Bitcoin itself will turn into an AI?
I mean, singularity narratives and, things becoming conscious narratives, there's so many of those. I mean, it was mentioned before, this idea that corporations as algorithms is a kind of one way of thinking of things. And I'm sure you guys will talk about, if you haven't, this idea of a paperclip replicator, this idea that one danger of an automated system is that it decides that making paperclips is the most important thing in the world, and then just only does that, and that's what the future of the world looks like. That's a simple way of thinking of it. But I mean, I think these projections can become also too much. And I think the important thing, which the last panel also said, is to remember that humans are in charge. And even if we have large automated systems, to make accountability in those humans that are working on defining them and thinking about what their backgrounds are, what their biases are, what their system, all these kind of things that have already been addressed is the most important thing. Because I don't think it necessarily needs to get to that level, or even can necessarily.
Okay.
Thank you.
Run.
Yeah. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Simon, who has to get his train in a few minutes. Well, of course, I cannot answer for him, but if you have any questions that I can try to answer, also in regard to art, we can still talk about that, contemporary art and AI. But before we do so, I just wanted to bring this up, which is very well known, but I kind of emphasize with the idea that was mentioned earlier that, well, we shouldn't think that everything that Hollywood puts up is going to be our reality. That said, it's quite uncanny how much of Philip K. Dick's predictions have become reality. And to some extent, Isaac Asimov, with his 3 rules for robots, long before any robot that really deserves the name in the strict sense was built, are still the founding ethics, let's say, of AI. I mean, it's the starting point, because that's where you have to start. If your main, like you said, like the paperclip thing, if you want to avoid any kind of self-deciding, any system that gets to a level where it makes decisions, right? And that's what we define in robots, I guess, that they are not just like cars doing something they are told, so to speak, but that they, like self-driving cars, become cars that have to do A or B or C in a given situation. And if they do C instead of A, then it can mean someone dies, right? So the obvious, I'll just read it out quickly. First one, a robot may not injure a human being or through inaction allow a human being to come to harm. Second law, a robot must obey the orders given it by human beings except where such orders would conflict with the first law. Pretty clear. Third law, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection doesn't conflict with the first or second laws. The third one is an interesting one because it doesn't necessarily directly concern humans, like if the robot self-destructs, where's the problem? But of course there comes in via Asimov the idea that the robot's use should be something that somehow generates something, a surplus, a wealth, so it can't be destructive in that sense, or self-destructive. I guess this is the thinking behind this. But then comes Mark Rottenberg, Director of Electronic Privacy Information Center in Washington, D.C. This is from the last years. I don't know exactly how old this is now. And he added 2 more laws. The fourth one, robots, and that's where the black box problem comes in. Robots must always reveal their identity and nature as a robot to humans when asked. Fifth law, robots must always reveal their decision-making process to humans when asked. Well, for me, the big question is why only when asked? Because if I don't know it's there, how can I ask it? And this is, I mean, we're not talking about some kind of strange science fiction scenario here. If you take that rule serious, the fourth one, you can say, if that rule would be put in place, then the kinds of algorithms that are not made transparent, that decide whether you get that or that credit rating or whether you get a health insurance or not, would have to make completely transparent. And that is not the case right now. So we're already talking about now. We're not talking about some distant future here. I mean, of course, if we understand these kinds of fields where these kinds of black box effects are in place, not necessarily only in the more strict sense, a more sort of a more complex interacting machine, because there you don't even see a machine literally. You just see someone behind a counter saying, sorry, we couldn't give you the health insurance. And as I said earlier, even that person themselves might in fact not be informed about the reasons for that decision. Same in China, with the social ranking systems, there will be decision making based on no actual factual transparency. Which will produce other problems. And there's been talk in different sources, including Google groups, about a sixth law, AI must not show bias toward any particular party, which comes out of all the recent observations about the factual biases that have taken place. Some have already been mentioned. To give one more typical example is facial recognition. The current facial recognition software that has been used in many applications has a racial bias because it simply doesn't recognize dark-skinned faces, and it often doesn't recognize quote-unquote Asian eyes as being open. So the photo would come back saying there's no person on the image, or it would come back saying the person's eyes are closed. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious that there is a racial bias in place, and it comes not necessarily about the programmer being consciously implementing that, but simply because the training system that fed the AI to make that facial recognition was simply stupidly and maybe in a racist way composed of people, too few of which were of these kinds of ethnicities. So there were basically, let's say, 95 white people and 5 non-white people, so the machine never properly learned to recognize that. I mean, facial recognition is a problem in itself for numerous reasons, but that's a particular typical outcome of bias, where a sort of, a presumption is amplified not only by the processing process, but then through the feeding process. But this has been mentioned more eloquently by you already. So finally, to come to art, one last thing there, because we touched on that. What does it actually mean for art to engage with AI? There's a history of artists doing that. Lynn Hirschman-Leeson famously did a work already in the 80s, I think, involving a fembot And there are artists currently working with AI, computational power. One example is Trevor Paitlin, who's critically examined how machine vision is now producing images for machines, which is a new development too, that we have imagery that is not made for the human eye, but for other machines to process. And this again has a lot to do with surveillance and so on. Another example, also very recent, up in London right now, is Pierre Ix's show at the Serpentine, for which he worked with a laboratory in Kyoto, Japan, who are working on trying to translate brain waves of people thinking of images back into images. And these images look rather strange. The big question there is, of course, how much is the artist actually twisting that process, or is he basically taking the process and putting it in the white cube and maybe adding some sprinkles on top? So for me, the question is, how can art get beyond adding another black box on top of the black box, if you understand what I mean? Because art always teases with the mysterious, you know, not making transparent the process that led something. And if you add that to AI, you've got a box covering a box. So.
A comprehensive question, is that like some national law, international law, who's respecting those laws?
This is science fiction.
So there is no like no yeah, but
yeah.
Like, is there like not the need like for like we have political laws, maybe like all the firms that they would agree on some laws along that line, or is that
I'm sure you know more about that, right? Yeah.
There is, let's say that's not an extension of Asimov's law, but there is a concept of Asilomar principles that has been devised by Future of Life Institute. It's one of the initiatives of Elon Musk, who, as we know, has a very interesting relationship with AI. On one hand, he's afraid of it, on the other, he's like loving it and investing. So he devised this concept of 10 principles or ethical guidelines for AI. That's the first attempt ever, really to treat that seriously, right? Because, as you said, before it was just science fiction. So that's the only kind of case I know where somebody's actually thinking more productively and practically.
But in a very concrete manner, the EU is discussing banning killer robots right now because, as you might know, this is really around the corner, or strictly speaking, it's already happening. What the CIA does with the drones is already AI. And there's been a case reported in November 2017 where the Pentagon, not the CIA in this case, had a staggering miscalculation of collateral damage by 31-1 caused by a faulty algorithm. So basically they thought they would have one person collateral damage when in fact they had 31 people dying as collateral damage. And that shows how scary that is. And especially in the battlefield where decisions are done that not only save or kill lives, but also create political crises and complete wars. You know, imagine the border between South and North Korea being guarded by robotic machines. And there, let's say, is a group of artists, that's a nice Freudian slip here, soldiers, trying to get from North Korea to South Korea as deserters. Would the machine be able to distinguish between deserters and attackers? Probably not at this stage. Maybe, I don't know, I'm not an expert in this, maybe in 20 years' time, maybe in 200 years' time, I have no idea. But at the moment, certainly not. Still, these machines might be put in place, if not by nations, by rogue powers, by guerrilla groups, and all these kinds of things going on. So we're not talking about a distant future. And especially when these questions come into play, like a robot should not harm a human being, this is already in place, you could say, you know.
I would like to recall these two sentences formulated by Lem in the 60s, which
Sorry, by whom?
by Lem in the 60s.
Yeah.
First was that infinite software does not need hardware, and infinite hardware does not need any software. So this is a religious question. So what do we call God? Infinite software or infinite hardware?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, sure, of course.
Oh,
Demanding
I feel
before the
humbled by
coffee
that
break.
question, infinitely, and yeah, I don't know. I really don't have an answer to that question at all. I think people more versed in the history of technology might rather.